the 26th Sunday of Ordinary Time. So we have to begin with a little Bible gospel study. It's a little confusing gospel. But as you remember last week, we had the vineyard owner being unfair in the eyes of the people who worked all day. So it's about the vineyard. So Israel was considered by the Israelites the vineyard of God, where things grew and were abundant. So Jesus used the vineyard often. So we have the wonderful story, and it's really within the Jewish tradition of, let me tell you a story, and then you kick it around. You try to figure out what's the real meaning of this story. So Jesus tells the story, as you know, if you've read the gospel, of the owners. The father goes to his first son and says, I want you to go into the vineyard to work today. And the son says, no, but then changes his mind and goes. So this story, remember, is told to the elders, the scribes, the Pharisees, the religious, legal functionaries. So do you know Jesus is saying something that's going to get their attention? So then he says, then their second son, he goes, you go into the vineyard, work all day. And he says, of course. And then he doesn't go. So Jesus says, well, what do you think? Who did the Father's will? He said, well, who did the Father's will was the one that said no, but went anyway and did it. That obedience is a doing. So then they say, who do you think did the Father's will? And he said, obviously the first one. And Jesus says, you've convicted yourselves. Well, what's the story about? And the Jewish rabbis love to ponder and come at things differently. And Jesus says, you know, John the Baptist came in righteousness, and you said no to him. What Jesus is talking in this gospel is not who worked in the vineyard, but who was free enough to change their minds. Change their minds. I thought of this in preparing this homily. When I was growing up, in my younger years, I didn't like girls. And maybe it was because of my older sister, I'm not sure. But girls were silly and dancing around. They didn't play sports. I didn't like girls until I met one, Polly, at a dance, and we became boyfriend and girlfriend. That changed my mind about girls and women. Women were all right because my mother was wonderful, my aunts and grandma. Girls, Polly changed my mind. And other girls later. Changed my mind about who I was, what was proper, what was relational. Jesus is trying to change the minds of the religious officials to what is righteousness, what is holiness, what is goodness. Is it strictly keeping the law out of fear? Is that religious? Is that righteousness? Or are you getting your righteousness by keeping the law? and making other people keep the law, and making other people keep the laws that you make. I highly recommend reading slowly the second reading from Philippians and the longer form. We'll be reading Philippians for a while on Sunday liturgies. But listen to this. Do nothing out of selfishness or out of vain glory. Rather, humbly regard others as more important than yourself. Each loving out, each looking out, not for his own interest, but also for those of others. I was talking to somebody recently who reminded me that I told her years ago she was having troubles with her roommates here at the college, university. And she said that I told her, if you want to think of yourself as perfect and good, live alone. And now she said that she's living with 3 roommates and a dog. And she's finding out that she's not as perfect as she'd like to be by living alone and having no relationships, but just being isolated. And you can convince yourself of your righteousness. Our holiness, in one way, what is it to be a perfect human being? We say Jesus was perfect. Was he? When are we perfect? How about this? Ponder this. Might be a little crazy, but what's new? I think being a perfect human being is being imperfect, is living with them. And living with people will show you that you're imperfect, but you are being a perfect human being by being limited and selfish and vainglorious. He says, don't do that. That's not good for you to live only for yourself. You can do that if you live alone. Pat yourself on your own back. But he said, live humbly. What is it to live humbly? It might be to live aware of human frailty, which is a human perfection. Amazing. And that human imperfection allows us to trust the perfection of God's love. So we're back to changing our minds about ourselves. As I said, I met Polly, and she met me, and she helped me meet me. And people do that. People help us meet ourselves. And we might not like the self that other people are giving a picture of us to ourselves. An image, a reality. We might not like that. And maybe that's where we change our minds about ourselves, in the love and the minds of other people. In my mind, I will always be concentrated on the imperfection, not on the perfection. And Paul writes, and we hear it in the rest of the reading, Jesus did not consider equality with God, the perfection of God, something to become to, but he became a human being. And he became obedient to his Father's will by being human. Jesus was imperfect in the way we are imperfect too. He was imperfect because he couldn't fly. He was imperfect because he couldn't change everybody else's mind. He wasn't a perfect teacher. He was perfectly Jesus. We are invited to be perfectly ourselves. And that's a struggle, because we also want to be vainglorious and consider ourselves more important than anybody else. Slowly, slowly, what we're being called to is to let Jesus meet us and change our minds and our hearts about ourselves and about our sisters and brothers. So we're in community. We look around in church. It is so good to go to church just to be with other human beings who are living with their imperfect humanity. The same as I am. To be in community is really an encouragement. It's part of receiving the body of Christ. And that can change our minds and hearts. So, who does the will of God? The one who struggles with herself or himself about what to do. We say no about this, we say no about that. Do you do it? The other son went, said no, but he went. We say yes and no, and we struggle to face the imperfection that causes us to say no and the grace that causes us to say yes.